The animals other than humans live by appearances and memories and have but little of connected experience, but the human race lives also by art and reasonings. This is a quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics, and what we see here is basically the idea that there exists a distinction between appearances, memories, experience, and then the higher faculties such as art or techne and reasonings or logismoi. So what this quote does is that it encapsulates Aristotle's view on the hierarchy of knowledge. Aristotle believed that knowledge is structured in a very specific way, from the lowest to the highest forms, and the higher forms build on top of the lower ones that they presuppose. The same approach is found in his other works. He always constructs a hierarchy of things from the lowest, which is associated with the basic faculties of perception or discrimination or something external to ourselves, and builds them up towards the highest intellectual faculties, which point at the divine, at something that is the source of intelligence or comprehension in humans. For example, the hierarchy of sciences, which he describes in his Metaphysics, where he says that first there goes physics, that studies changeable things like plants, animals, stars, things that have matter in them. Then there goes mathematics, that studies things abstracted from matter, numbers, shapes, lines. And finally, there is the first philosophy, or metaphysics, that studies being qua being, including things completely without matter and change, God or pure intellects. Another example of a similar hierarchy appears in Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about a completely different topic when ranking different types of goods. The first being external goods, such as wealth, friends, reputation, good birth. Then there go bodily goods, health, strength, beauty. And finally, there are goods of the soul, which are wisdom, courage, justice, or temperance. The goods of the intellect are included in this category of goods, but he famously distinguishes between moral virtues, something like courage or temperance or other noble traits of character, and intellectual virtues, which are basically the topic of this video. But before addressing the intellectual virtues, let's start with something with which Aristotle himself starts, or which he conceives as the basis for all the other types of knowledge. Let's start with perception, or aesthesis, from which the word aesthetics derives. So perception is the very basic type of knowledge, or in Greek, gnosis, which is shared among all animals. This is a discriminatory faculty of an animal. It is something that distinguishes animals from plants. Animals are endowed with perception, which happens through sense organs. Perception is the actuality or fulfillment, the telos of the sense organs. Our sense organs are designed to perceive. We need eyes, ears, skin, nose, and tongue in order to perceive things. Different animals have different ways or different means of perception. However, the mechanism is the same according to Aristotle. Basically, the organ receives the form of a thing without receiving its matter via a certain medium, for example, air for sight, hearing, and smell. It is quite curious that this epistemic hierarchy is preserved even on the level of perceptual knowledge. So he says in De Anima, for example, that touch is the most basic or the most general sense common to all animals. It is also the one that has the fewest distinctions. Touch apprehends only some general qualities like hot, cold, dry, moist, or rough. And then there goes smell, which is also not very discriminative. Hearing is already better, because hearing allows us to apprehend speech, music, certain things that reveal something essential about the world. And then sight is the highest and most reliable type of perception. Sight grasps the most differences. It grasps colors, shape, size, movement. These are the most essential distinctions in the world. Even though perception is the most basic type of knowledge and is not strictly intellectual, since it is more of a dunamis, that is a potentiality or a certain natural capacity for receiving certain types of impressions. This is nevertheless important because perception is the level where all knowledge begins. I'll now briefly explain two other levels of knowledge, memory and experience, which also share a lot with perception in not being intellectual in the strict or rigorous sense. And then we'll move to reviewing the types of knowledge in the proper intellectual sense. These are Sophia, Nous, Episteme, Phronesis, and Techne. By the way, perception is also the level where fantasia takes place, which is very interesting because it encompasses dreams or animal motivation, how animals imagine or visualize certain stimuli to pursue what they want. Not only humans do that, according to Aristotle. Animals also have fantasia. This is a very intriguing topic, but I won't be exploring it in depth in this episode. So now I want to explain the two other non-intellectual capacities. Perception was already covered, and it is the most basic form of gnosis, that is, knowledge. But it is important to remember that perception is not knowledge in the proper sense of the word. Aristotle never calls perception noesis. Noesis belongs to the strictly intellectual types of knowledge, whereas perception is aesthesis, something that we perceive through the senses. The next element in this same group of non-intellectual types of knowledge is memory. Memory is a very interesting thing. It immediately evokes the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne, and it is something extremely archaic from the very oldest times, because the goddess of memory is a Titan goddess. So memory refers to the past, and Aristotle always says that memory is the retention of past experiences. Basically, memory appears when certain perceptions build one on top of the other and stabilize within us. Memory is essential for the formation of higher kinds of knowledge, since without memory, no universals could be grasped. Only repeated perceptions preserved in memory allow us to apprehend anything at a genuinely universal level. This helps explain the importance of memory in Greek culture. The river Lethe symbolizes forgetfulness in the afterlife, while the Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally means unforgetfulness or unconcealment, bringing something back. Plato develops this insight in his theory of anamnesis, recollection, according to which knowledge is recollected from previous lives. Memory, therefore, plays a foundational role in cognition. At the next level, the third of the non-intellectual capacities is imperia, or experience. This is already something more serious. Experiences are basically consolidated memories that connect to one another and lead to a certain pre-rational grasp of particular facts. So you can think of experience as something basic, like being exposed to the same type of event repeatedly. For example, in personal dieting, if you're not familiar with the scientific principles of nutrition, but you notice over time that whenever you skip dinner, let's say you lose weight, you form a connection between not eating dinner and losing weight. And this pattern gets reinforced. This is basically what experience is about. Experience grounds these three non-intellectual capacities or potentialities for knowledge that I discussed: perception and memory. But it is very important not to confuse experience with the higher intellectual forms of knowledge, especially techne, art or craft knowledge, and episteme, scientific understanding. Experience gives us reliable particular judgments, like the example that Aristotle himself gives. This remedy worked for Callias when he had this disease. But experience cannot explain why it worked or grasp the universal cause. Techne and episteme, on the other hand, know the universal, and the reason why something happened. This mistake of conflating experience with techne and episteme is dangerous because if we treat mere experience as full scientific knowledge, we risk acting on unreliable generalizations or failing to understand real causes. For example, an experienced doctor who has seen hundreds of cases might successfully treat most patients by pattern recognition alone. But without understanding the underlying principles, he could fail in unusual cases or be unable to teach others reliably. Aristotle himself warns that many people mistake long experience for genuine expertise, but the true expert can demonstrate why something works and apply it universally. And now we can turn to the 5 intellectual virtues themselves, which in different ways relate to the universal. Now we're moving from the non-intellectual capacities, or dunamis, alogoi, to the intellectual virtues, or aretai dianetikai. The first of the intellectual virtues, starting from the lowest, is techne. It immediately evokes the Promethean myth. Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from Olympus and handed it to people, thereby endowed them with the arts, technology, and creation, or poesis, from which, by the way, the word poetry comes. Techne is concerned with external production based on true rational principles. The difference between mere experience, imperia, and techne is that techne is first of all teachable because it is generalized and it grasps the universal causes. For example, if we want to build a house, we follow specific instructions. We take this type of wood, combine it in this and this way, and we know why we need to do that. Under a certain pressure, the house would simply collapse. So the geometrical shape must be appropriate, the material needs to be fitted, and in general there are many different nuances that a person accumulates when pursuing techne as a craft and as a reasoned knowledge. Animals can possess certain primitive experience. A horse understands that it's supposed to avoid certain route at which it was hurt, for example, based on experience. However, animals are not capable of techne. They're not capable of constructing things based on rational causes. Even when they produce complex things, as Aristotle observes, animals like spiders weaving webs or swallows building mud nests do so neither by techne nor by inquiry or deliberation, but by nature, physis, a certain internal principle that guides them instinctively, without the reasoned, universal, or teachable understanding that characterizes human techne. One more thing about techne that is worth noting is that it's morally neutral or ambiguous, something that both Plato and Aristotle point out. The same knowledge can be used for good or bad ends. A doctor who is experienced and not merely experienced but possesses techne can heal someone or deliberately harm them with the exact same skills. Unlike ethical virtues that always aim at what's good, techne simply gives you the ability to produce something, and it doesn't decide or doesn't define whether the result is right or wrong. Just as in the myth, Prometheus ends up suffering terribly for giving us this power that was reserved only for the gods. So the people who use techne sometimes suffer from its consequences, or from the consequences of what they have created. Okay, so now we come to phronesis, or practical wisdom. In contrast to techne, where the goal is some external product or good, like building something, phronesis is all about living well, about perfecting the moral virtues themselves. Virtues like courage, temperance, justice, magnanimity, etc. Phronesis is inseparable from a person's character. You don't get it just by reading a book or following formulas. It comes through real experience and through actually working on your character and refining it over time. And this refining happens largely through habituation. You start by doing the right actions, even if you're forcing it a bit at first, maybe following rules or imitating good people. And little by little, through repetition and practice, those actions shape your feelings and desires until acting virtuously becomes natural and pleasurable. And here's what's really difficult. There are no fixed universal rules for phronesis. It's a highly nuanced type of knowledge, and it depends on the situation. And it's also genuinely hard to acquire. This is exactly where Aristotle's doctrine of the mean fits in. Every moral virtue lies in a mean between two extremes, or two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. For example, with courage, the excess of courage is not of courage, but the excess or one of the vices is recklessness. It's when a person basically acts blindly without experiencing any sort of fear. The deficiency would be cowardice or holding back when a person shouldn't. So the virtue, the courage itself as the virtue, is right in the middle between these two extremes. Same works with temperance, overindulgence on one side and insensibility on the other side. So, and in this case as well, the right thing is in the mean, the right amount or the right way or the right time, and it is generally very intricate. Because how do you actually find that mean? It sounds pretty vague. Aristotle says that the person who already has phronesis or the phronimos, the truly noble and virtual person, can see the mean clearly. That person is in a way the standard or the measure for everything else. So phronesis can be developed, but not like techne. It really comes through experience and is transmitted best by being around the phronimos or this noble person, but by spending time with someone who already lives this way, watching how they deliberate, how they act, how they feel about things in real situations. It is much more personal, something that you absorb through example and shared life. With phronesis, we ascend from the external, product-oriented world of techne to something much higher and more human, the realm of praxis or action for its own sake, where the end isn't something we make and leave behind, but the good life itself, the beautiful, well-lived existence that perfects our very souls. And when we look for examples of people who have this, we naturally turn to the great figures in Greek poetry, Odysseus with his shrewd judgment and self-control, or someone like Nestor, whose wisdom comes from long years of experience. These are the kinds of models Aristotle has in mind, the real phronimoi who show what it looks like to get things right in action. Next comes episteme, which is scientific or demonstrative knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge Aristotle develops in detail in his prior and posterior analytics. And basically, in these works, he lays the groundwork for what we now recognize as formal logic, with his syllogistic system at the center. Episteme is concerned with demonstration. It starts from true, indemonstrable first principles, things that are primary and necessary, and then shows, step by step, why certain conclusions must follow, always explaining things for their real causes, not for their accidents. Aristotle spends a lot of time in the posterior analytics distinguishing real scientific understanding from weaker forms of knowledge. A key point he makes is that genuine demonstration has to go from cause to effect and not the other way around. He gives this famous example with planets and twinkling in Posterior Analytics book Alpha. You could construct a syllogism like, everything that twinkles is near. He means near to Earth. Planets twinkle. Therefore, planets are near. Basically, that gets you to the right conclusion, but Aristotle says that it's not true episteme, because it reasons from the effect, or twinkling, back to the cause, nearness. It's more like a sign or indicator, useful maybe for discovery, but it doesn't give real explanatory understanding. So the proper scientific demonstration flips it. Everything near in the atmosphere's range twinkles because the light gets refracted. Planets are near. Therefore, planets twinkle. So now we're explaining the why. The twinkling happens because of nearness, and that's the causal direction that matters for real knowledge. Or you can think of leaves rustling and the wind blowing. Saying the leaves are rustling, therefore the wind is blowing, might be a reasonable guess. But it's not demonstrative because many things can make the leaves rustle. A person shaking the branch, a squirrel jumping for the tree, or something else entirely. True demonstration would go the other way. The wind is blowing, therefore the leaves are rustling. From the cause to the necessary effect. It is the same as with twinkling. So this causal priority is a huge deal for Aristotle, and it sets his idea of science apart from a lot of modern formal logic, which often doesn't care about real causes and simply cares about validity or valid inference. For Aristotle, episteme has to capture the real structure of the world. Another important thing is that episteme deals only with what cannot be otherwise, with eternal necessary truths. It's not about contingent facts like who won a battle or variable human affairs. Such things are more about phronesis. Episteme is about universals, geometry, astronomy, biology at its deepest level. Things that always hold. That's why episteme ranks higher than both techne and phronesis in Aristotle's hierarchy. Techne is productive. It is made at making changeable things. Phronesis is practical. It is aimed at good action in particular variable situations. But episteme is purely contemplative. It's knowledge for its own sake, knowledge of what is eternal and necessary. You pursue it not to build something, or not to act better. You pursue it simply because understanding the truth about reality is intrinsically valuable and fulfilling. And still, even episteme depends on something higher. It gives us the method, the syllogistic tools to demonstrate conclusions once we already have the first principles. But Aristotle openly admits that it doesn't explain how we originally grasp those indemonstrable starting points, the archai, the true foundations, like the whole is greater than the part, for example, or the principle of non-contradiction. For that, we need to move up to the next level, to nous, intellectual intuition, which directly apprehends those primary truths without needing proof. Yet episteme is a beautiful, rigorous type of knowledge that explains the why behind necessary things, and it's a huge step up. Toward the contemplative life that Aristotle values the most. So now we reach the very top of the intellectual virtues, nous and Sophia. These are the highest intellectual excellences, and Aristotle clearly distinguishes them from the lower three, tekne, phronesis, and episteme. The lower virtues are connected with a contingent world. Tekne concerns production, things that we make that could always be otherwise. Phronesis concerns action, human conduct that varies with circumstances. And episteme, although it is demonstrative knowledge and it is the knowledge of universals and necessity, is often exercised in sciences whose objects involve matter and change, such as physics. Nous and Sophia, by contrast, are concerned with what is necessary, with what is eternal and unchanging, the highest objects of knowledge. First, let's discuss nous, which is usually translated as intellect or intuitive understanding. This is the capacity by which we directly grasp the first principles, archai, the indemonstrable starting points upon which all demonstrative knowledge, or episteme, depends. These principles cannot themselves be proven by syllogistic reasoning. Any attempt to do so would already presuppose them. Rather, they must be apprehended immediately. Aristotle emphasizes that while nous develops gradually through experience with particulars by a kind of inductive process, the act of grasping the principle itself is simple and non-discursive. It is not a step-by-step inference. It is immediate seeing or recognition of the truth. Then comes Sophia, philosophical wisdom, which Aristotle defines as the combination of nous and episteme. Sophia concerns the highest and most honorable objects. Sophia therefore includes both the intuitive grasp of first principles, or nous, and the demonstrative knowledge that proceeds from them, or episteme, but only where the subject matter is eternal, necessary, and divine. This is why Sophia belongs preeminently to first philosophy, or theology. It is knowledge of being at its highest level, of ultimate causes and unchanging reality. Sophia is thus the intellectual virtue of the philosopher. It is pursued entirely for its own sake, not for production, action, or practical benefit. In contemplation, the intellect is engaged in its most perfect activity, and in doing so, we become most like the gods, whose life is pure contemplation. Aristotle argues that this contemplative life is the happiest and most self-sufficient form of human existence, because it fulfills the highest part of our nature. Moral virtue and practical wisdom remain necessary as conditions for a well-ordered life, but they are not what define this highest form of activity. When we reach nous and Sophia, then, we have moved beyond making things and doing something within the changing world, and entered the realm of pure knowing, the contemplative life that Aristotle places at the very summit of human excellence. To bring everything together, let's lay out the full hierarchy of knowledge and the soul's capacities that Aristotle constructs, from the very highest down to the lowest. At the top stands Sophia, philosophical wisdom. Then nous, the intuitive grasp of first principles, episteme, demonstrative scientific knowledge, then phronesis, or practical wisdom, and then techne, art or craft. Below these properly intellectual virtues go the capacities of the soul. These are imperia, connected with experience, memory, and at the very base, perception or aesthesis. This structure reflects the levels of the soul itself. Plants possess only the nutritive soul. They grow, feed, reproduce, but nothing more. Animals rise higher. They have perception, memory, and some degree of experience. Desires tied to sensation. But humans are unique. We are like a microcosm containing all these levels within us. We have the nutritive, the perceptive, the experiential, the technical, the practical, the scientific, the intuitive, and, in the best cases, Sophia. Every lower capacity is present and presupposed in us, building toward the highest. I actually discussed this idea in one of my previous videos, where I talked about the body itself as representing the divine, how the human form, with its senses and capacities arranged in a certain hierarchy, mirrors the structure of reality and points toward higher truths. And the person who actualizes the very highest level, the philosopher who lives primarily through Sophia, is the most complete human type, the one who comes closest to the divine activity of pure contemplation. But this hierarchy is not just a classification or a simple list. It is an invitation to ascend. We all begin in the sensory world, the world of appearances, particulars, the vivid, changing realm that Homer describes so powerfully. And Aristotle does not ask us to reject that world. Instead, the path is to rise through it, to integrate every level, to reconcile the temporal and changing with the eternal. This is what gives Aristotle's philosophy its cultural depth and integrity. The philosopher seeks the eternal amid the temporal, sees the unchanging principles at work within change itself. At the center of everything stands the unmoved mover, the pure thought thinking itself, eternal and perfect. This divine actuality is the source of all being, giving the universe its meaning and order. Everything else is drawn toward it through its telos, the final purpose, striving to become more actual and more like that perfect thought. Yet, there is a profound tension here, almost a quiet tragedy. Complete fulfillment of the telos would mean becoming fully identical with pure thought. And in that moment, the individual thing, with its particular form and matter, would cease to exist as such. The purpose can never be entirely realized in the changing world without the thing itself disappearing. That is why the ascent is not only philosophical but also heroic. It requires a noble readiness to embrace this inevitable limit, to pursue the highest with clarity and dignity, knowing that the path toward perfection is endless in this life, yet still the most meaningful and fulfilling one that we can choose. Aristotle's philosopher lives with this awareness, integrating perception, action, craft, virtue, and science, while keeping the gaze fixed on the eternal center that gives everything its direction and worth. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, like it and subscribe to the channel. And see you in the next episodes about philosophy.